my biggest advice would be not to tell the next generation down how the business has to be. Even though this is working now, doesn't mean that it'll work later. And you don't want to dismiss what their ideas or things might be that, it could be better, it could be different, whatever it is. But, you got to let it be their own too. Otherwise, all they're doing is trying to carry on your legacy, and that's not fair to them. If you're the upper person, let them put their spin on it. Otherwise, it won't become theirs too.
Welcome to Main Street Makers, a bi-weekly podcast that features real, local small business owners who have transformed their passions into profitable businesses. Learn from fellow small business owners on how they overcome challenges, find opportunities, and create thriving operations that make our neighborhoods more vibrant, connected places to live. I'm Catherine, and this podcast is brought to you by NAF, the business credit platform that believes every small business owner deserves a chance to succeed. Now, let's get to this week's show. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Main Street Makers. I'm excited today to welcome Edan McPherson. He's the owner of Paloma Fine Arts, a fabrication studio where they partner with artists to build installations in public places like airports and museums. They have done projects such as the famous Chocolate Room with Ed Ruscha. So welcome, Edan.
Hi, how are you doing?
Great. We're really excited to have you.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Catherine.
Of course. So the first thing I'd love to start out with, tell us about your business. How did it start and how's it going?
Okay, I'm second generation. We're a small family business. My father started the business in the 70s as a fine arts silkscreen printing shop. And then over the years, he did limited edition fine art prints. So limited edition being like only from a handful to, a few hundred, and typically signed by the artist. And then around the 80s, we started dabbling in small fabrication and doing things that were printed on. So objects that were silkscreen printed on, things like that. And then one of the people that we did prints with, one of the artists, Jonathan Broski, was working with a fabrication company out of New Jersey, Lippincott, that closed down. And when they closed down, he approached us and he said, well, would you guys be interested in doing, some more fabrication in these things? And so there was a shift at that point that we were doing both printing and fabrication. And not necessarily on the large scale that we do now, but over maybe 5 or 6 years, we went to a scale that, was pieces that are as much as 100 feet tall. And so it was quite an immense shift and extreme learning curve, but really exciting and fun.
Yeah,
so that's
cool.
primarily what we do today is fabrication.
Okay, that's awesome. Yeah, that is quite the shift. Could you tell me a little more about that transition? It sounds like there was some demand, but I imagine that was quite a transition from the perspective of the equipment that you need, the skills that you need. What was that like?
So a lot of equipment. We were in a small shop that was primarily just a silk screening shop. And then in the back, we had put just some trailers together, like the trailers that you pull behind trucks, but they were flat on the ground, and we made a little fabrication area. And so we were building frames and things like that for stretchers, for canvases, things like that. And then it was still primarily printing. And then we moved shops to another shop that had kind of 4 warehouses. And so at that time, we were able to kind of departmentalize the area. So we had a print shop area, a cutting area, kind of a wood shop area, and then a 4th shop that was just kind of whatever we needed it for. And so that was when we really made the big transition, because then we could, kind of specialize in each one of these different areas. And then in between the 4 shops, there was a large outdoor area, so we could start doing larger scale projects there. And that was maybe mid 80s. And that's when we made kind of the big transition into fabrication. But we were still doing screen printing projects at that time. But it was it was an interesting dynamic because we didn't have like a crew that was doing screen printing and a crew that was doing fabricating. Like we had screen printers that worked for us that's mostly what they did. But then the fabricators would have to come over and help and do that. And then the screen printers would have to come over to the fabrication because it was still just kind of a small business, a small crew. So everybody had to help out everywhere. And typically you would only work in, one of these four shops or two of the four shops at a time.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I was going to actually ask you about that. Did you have to start hiring for a particular skill set? Did people learn on the job? What was that like?
Yeah, since we started silk screen printing, we kind of had a couple people that we primarily, had with silk screening, and then they would help us with other things. But yeah, when we started doing fabrication, we had to, hire welders and metal workers. Yeah, for sure, we had to start hiring people that were specific. And that's kind of where I started focusing more on the fabrication and going to school for welding and doing those things more than the silk screening side. I kind of grew up in the silk screening side, but my focus was more on the fabrication side.
So, how many employees do you have? And is it a mix of full time and contractors? Like, how do you kind of work that out?
Yeah, so it does vary, and when you're doing a large project, it can increase. But right now we have four employees that work in the shop. And then, sometimes there's a few people that I know really well that I'll bring in sometimes on a weekly basis to do some work is really helpful. But I try to keep, a core group that's working all the time.
Gotcha. And those people that you bring in weekly, are those like specialists that kind of help fill in
Yeah,
some
they have a
gaps?
long history in the art fabrication world, not just fabrication world, but art fabrication world, and have specialties that really help the business.
That's interesting. Did your dad start to continue to take over a lot of the screen printing while you built the fabrication arm?
Well, no, not really. He was kind of into both. The transition that he kind of made from silk screening, and he did a lot of the fabrication and stuff too, but he started kind of transforming into taking those skill sets maybe into drawings and doing the plans and creating shop drawings and even engineering drawings and things like that. And so I think that's where he kind of kept it in that realm maybe. But yeah, I was definitely more in the fabrication shop side.
Yeah, that's really cool. I don't know if you remember this, but do you remember anything about how you financed that transition? Because I would imagine that, with any kind of shift there's quite a bit of investment that needs to happen.
Yeah, so I think there was a couple ways. We did get some small business loan money. My father took out a second on his house to finance that shop, and then some of the artists help us finance, with projects, helped us finance some of the equipment needs that we had, things like that. On the front end of knowing that there was more big projects to come.
Yeah, and how did that financing with the artist work? Was that kind of like net terms or was it something else?
No, it wasn't really net term. It was more like kind of like, a family loan in a way, where it's like I'll lend it to you now knowing that, I'll make up for it later. Yeah.
Yeah. So you had like a really good community, it sounds like, around you.
Yeah, well, especially at first, we only kind of worked with a handful of artists that we already had good relationships with. And so I think that helped with some of that financing and helping, say, hey, can we, borrow $30,000 to get through the next month or two.
Yeah, that's really cool. We hear that a lot from business owners because financing can be so tricky to get, especially if you don't have like the proven revenue. You're like trying to invest in something new. And so we recently talked to someone who was kind of in a similar situation, was looking to expand and ended up getting some help from friends and family. So that's a very common story.
Yeah, it seems like when you go to try to get financing from the bank, it's like, well, what assets are you willing to give us of your own personal if this doesn't work out? Which, I can understand the money has to come from somewhere and they don't want to risk it, but it's hard as a small business owner thinking, oh, if this doesn't work out, am I going to, lose my home or something? And, if I was an employee somewhere, there wouldn't be that risk. It's hard.
Yeah, for sure. You also mentioned, kind of on the topic of finances, that in the beginning, a couple of your challenges were managing money and budgeting. Could you talk to us about that? Like, is there like a specific moment that comes to mind of like where that challenge was really present?
You just kind of you watch how much money's coming in and you watch how much money is going out, and it can ebb and flow when you have a lot of work. You feel really comfortable and your bank account, feels nice and solid. And then, towards the end of jobs, or, when things are slow, you start going, am I going to make it through the next month or the next couple of weeks? And that can be, that can be kind of scary. I've been really lucky that things have kept coming along and I've been able to keep going. But, I could definitely see a scenario where, if you don't get that next job, you don't get that phone call. It's like, you start having to think about, well, what decisions do I have to do? Do I have to, do I keep trying to push on, or do I start to liquidate? What do I do? And as you watch that account go down, you have to start thinking about those things. And it can be hard on your emotions.
Right. I imagine you're kind of like always preparing for the worst in a way.
Right.
Was there like a moment in time that you realized like I need to hire help to help with the financial side so that I can focus on other things in the business?
I think that realization happened even before I took that over, when I was working with my father, and even though I wasn't in the office, I saw that struggle and stuff in the way that he was running the business, and I knew that that was something that was going to be super important. But also, I was really fortunate that the office manager that I have now worked in the industry, and that opportunity came up to be able to have her here and working. And so it was a little bit of luck, a little bit of understanding that that was something that the company desperately needed, helping to keep on top of what needs to be paid and keeping all those things running smoothly. I couldn't do that without her doing those things. And it's been a lifesaver for sure. But mostly, it's just trying to keep things coming in, to try to keep money in the bank so that we can keep paying our bills. So, it's looking for work and keeping the work coming.
Yeah. So it sounds like you've outsourced a lot of your financial management to an office manager, and then you focus more on bringing in clients and bringing in business. Is that like a good read of how you've broken it down?
Yes, I would say so. And there was a opportunity, and that opportunity kind of started before my dad was fully retired. And she started helping out. And then when that transition happened, where my dad retired fully, she stepped up even more and really helped create the business the way it is today and the way it's running today. So there was a little bit of a transition there. Yeah, I'm a big fan.
Yeah, it sounds like it. It sounds like she may have brought like level of maturity to the way that you're operating. Is that true?
Uh, that, and plus she worked in the industry for a long time, so she has resources and relationships and all those things too that have expanded the business more too. Like I said, a great opportunity, and it's worked out really well, and I'm super thankful that that happened. Um, Not sure where I would be right now with all that, because it's a hard transition when when somebody that's been doing it for so long kind of steps aside. You have to kind of take over that whole role plus whatever role you had on your own because, before it was kind of a split. I was kind of doing more of the shop stuff and he was maybe doing more of the drawings and office stuff. And then when one person kind of leaves, just like if a partner left, you have to take over that role too.
Yeah. So she really helped kind of fill that gap and bring you to that next level of growth and
Yeah,
expansion.
fill that gap and expand it into new ways and and bring in new relationships. Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. A great example of how hiring the right person is really like an investment in your business and in your growth.
Yeah. Yeah. Certainly.
I think it's so interesting what you said about how you were observing kind of how your dad was running the business. And that's kind of where you saw that there was a need. Were there other things just kind of growing up in a small business household that where you were like watching how the business was run and you kind of looked at it and you were like, I don't know, maybe like we could do that differently or we could change something?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there was probably even a lot of arguments with family about how things should be done and how things should be run and all that. And the issue is when your father is the boss, you know, you only have a small vote with no veto power, and he's got all the veto power. But yeah, I think observing that for a lot of years has been good and helpful and being able to run the business now. I think any small business owner, if they have a chance to see how a business is run ahead of time, it's going to be a huge benefit to them to be able to know everything that's involved with it. There just is so much involved in running a business. It's not just making a product or selling a product. It's like the back end stuff is overwhelming. And even if you have people helping you do it, you have to understand how that stuff works, or you have to understand everything that's involved with all the insurances and bonds. And in our business we have engineering and licensing and all sorts of stuff that all has to go into place. And we work with government agencies, and that's a whole nother layer of bureaucracy that can extend and make projects that you think you have go on for months and months and years sometimes before it actually happens. So you got to try to balance all those things.
Yeah, there's a lot of paperwork and invisible work, if you will, of running a business for sure. On that note, you mentioned, obviously growing up, you're you have no veto power against your dad. As you came into the business, was there any kind of like practical layer of having like a stake in ownership, or how did that dynamic change as you became more of a partner in the business?
Yeah. Like at some point, our small business incorporated. And at that point, there was a little bit of a gifting or earning of some of the business. At that point was a smaller percentage of it, but it was something which I think helped feel like you had more invested into it than just an employee, even though it was a family company. So that was good. And then at some point, my father kind of got older and decided it was time to kind of stop, and there wasn't really any kind of formal deal. He just kind of was like, I'm gonna go home now, and if you need help, let me know. And so that was kind of that transition to me being kind of in charge of the business.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm really curious about how, it's your family, but there's also the formality and the formal layer of who runs the business and owns the business. How have you found navigating that?
Yeah, that's a complicated question, and it's come up, and sometimes there was no resolution to it, and it was like talked about. And there was even a point that my father remarried, and how is that going to influence ownership, or what's going to happen with that. So there was a lot of questions with that, and some of that got worked out just by talking about it and, put in trust and things like that. But other stuff that was just kind of still kind of left on the table that just kind of worked itself out in time, just, by the sake of, okay, I'm kind of done doing this now and I'd like you to take over.
Yeah. From your experience, and I know that you're also thinking about the next generation, do you have any advice for people who are running family businesses on like how to manage the two side by side?
Yeah, it's a tough question. And I don't even know, like my son works here now, but I'm not even sure if that's what he wants to pursue long term or if he wants to, maybe shape it into something else or if maybe there's other people that want to be involved and that could let the business live on that way, and not necessarily with my son if that's not something that he's interested in taking on. Not quite sure yet. Right now, I'm still just focused on making sure that it, lives another day. But as far as advice for other people, as far as generational, I would say my biggest advice would be not to tell the next generation down how the business has to be. Like, even though this is working now, doesn't mean that it'll work later. And you don't want to dismiss what their ideas or things might be that, it could be better, it could be different, whatever it is. But, you got to let it be their own too. Otherwise, all they're doing is trying to carry on your legacy, and that's not fair to them. So I think that would be the biggest advice is, if you're the upper person, let them put their spin on it, and otherwise it won't become theirs too.
Right. That makes a ton of sense. And I think that's good advice, not just for family owned businesses, but for really any business or any leader that wants to, delegate and grow the next generation of workers and evolve their business. I'm curious if we could go back to some of the financial operations side. You obviously, it's very material heavy. A lot of labor is involved in the things that you do. How do you finance those things and make sure that you can provide them while you like build something? And obviously, you're getting paid later.
There's a couple different ways that we go about that. We have larger projects and we have smaller projects. And sometimes larger projects help front end smaller projects. So, you get that financing and you kind of cross mingle a little bit. You want to try to keep things separate because it makes it a lot harder to, but sometimes that's just the reality of what you have to do as a business owner. If you can, you want to try to get, a nice deposit in front that covers the bulk of the materials that you need to get started and labor and, things to get moving so that you can get to that first milestone, and that next payment. And so if you can, you want to try to front load that payment, initial start of the contract, enough to make sure that you're covering your costs up to that first milestone where you get those next payments. Because if you run out of money in that first part, it's going to be really hard. And you don't want to have to steal from other things to try to cover things because then you can end up getting yourself in a lot of trouble. So that's the way we've tried to do it, is try to, front load the contract as much as we can. And then, just try to be careful with that and then keep things coming in. I mean, that's the biggest thing is, you got to keep producing work in order to get more jobs in line.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. What does a typical payment plan look like with a client? Like you mentioned that you try to get a deposit up front. Do you have like typical payment terms that you try to work out with clients that you found work for you?
It varies, depending on the job and the size of the job. If you can get a 50% deposit on the job, up front, or 40%, something like that, that covers materials. Because you're talking about the kind of work that we're doing, materials is really expensive. It can be a lot more than your typical building type job where the materials account for a lot of the cost of of the whole piece. We'll try to front load it, like I said, up, maybe 50%. And then do, 15, 15, 10, something like that, where you have milestones, once the piece is, halfway produced, or it gets to a certain type of fabrication milestone, or if it's like needs to be fabricated and then painted and then this. So we'll put those milestones in there, and then there'll be payments at those milestones. So sometimes that next payment helps you get the money to do that next segment of the fabrication.
Right. Okay. And then what about on the back end? Like, do you also seek out payment terms with your suppliers?
No, not typically. Suppliers, some have credit, but if they're going to deliver their material, whether it's, a whole bunch of bulk aluminum plate or something like that, they want their money. They don't want terms. Yeah, so you kind of have to put that money out there and do that.
Gotcha.
And some of these projects, they'll last a year. So it's, you're talking about stretching this out a long time, and then filling in, dead time with smaller things if you can.
Right. So it sounds like the biggest solution for you is just trying to make sure that there's always work and trying to get the deposits, because you can't really always work out payment terms with your suppliers.
Yeah. And then timing. I mean, the other thing is timing. It's like you have to know, do I want to put this money out now, or, should I try to stretch this a little before I have to make this next big payment towards materials or things like that, because I know that I'm not going to get to this next milestone by this date. So you have to be careful of those things. But then, the overhead, that overhead comes every month no matter what. And so you have to keep that in mind too.
Right. That makes a ton of sense. Because having a constant stream of business is so important, how do you make sure that you have that pipeline going at all times? Like, do you have any particular techniques or things that you're always employing to make sure that you always have business?
Yeah. So our business is really unique. I mean, building sculpture isn't something that a lot of people do. And it's not going to be your typical, can I advertise, or your typical ways to bring clients in wouldn't necessarily work with this business model. And it's mostly been word of mouth and reputation and just being around so long. But you also have to foster relationships. And so that's really important, to foster relationships within the industry, to keep up on those relationships, to make sure you communicate. So even if there's nothing going on and no jobs going on, to keep communicating with, those people that so that when something does come up, you're still in their head and they're still thinking about you. So relationships are super important.
Yeah, I'm curious. Some people feel like if nothing's going on, they feel like awkward about reaching out. When you feel like kind of nothing's going on, but you still want to keep in contact with someone, like, how do you do that?
Yeah. You just have to, I know sometimes it's really uncomfortable, and you're like, what am I doing? Am I just bothering these people, or, but you just got to do it. And, most of the time I find that the person's glad to hear from you or talk to you. And, and sometimes when you reach out to people and it's not just about business, it can deepen that relationship too. And then when they do business with you, there's a deeper connection, and that I think can foster, goodwill, especially if, when it comes time to like deliver things like that. And, let's say you're running a little late, or that time when you needed to borrow a little money from somebody or things like that. If you keep fostering all those relationships, that conversation's easier if you've had the conversations when you didn't need things from them, or you weren't just looking for a job. So they're important things to do, whether they're uncomfortable or not. And I think once you start doing it, it's not as hard.
It becomes more natural because it's just people, it's friends, it's business friends, and it's your community.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, I mean, we're all people, and we have to have connections beyond
Right.
business. And if you're doing business with people, that's a relationship. And, it's not typical that you keep, you know, a relationship strictly business. So I think it's good to foster those things.
Yeah, that's amazing advice. So, my last note, you've been in business for so long. You grew up in a business. Do you have any words of wisdom for other people who are looking to start a business or who may be kind of like newer in their journey?
Uh, I think owning your own business is a lot of work. It can be really stressful, but there's a lot of great things about it. Having freedom to do things when you want to do things or need to do things. It can be really rewarding because you get to pick and do what you want. As far as like advice, I would say, remember to try to keep a balance too. If you got family life and those things, remember that part of the advantage of having your own business is that if there's a softball game you need to go to or something like that, make that happen, because those things are important too. And then you can make it up for it on the other end, because you're not working 9 to 5, you're working wherever the work needs to be done. And so fostering all those relationships is good and important if you're a business owner.
Yeah, it's all about balance, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and it's easy to get sucked into putting all your effort into work, especially if you start to struggle with it. And it's like, if it completely devours you, I think it leads you down a path that's not healthy.
Yeah, that's fair because there's advantages and disadvantages to not being on the clock, you know?
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
Well,
Yeah.
that's everything. Thank you so much for joining us. I feel like there's so many great nuggets in here. We know that a lot of business owners are interested in like having a business to build their family legacy. So it's really special to be able to talk to someone who has kind of been through it and is doing it, so that people kind of have something to reference and look forward to.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you.
Thank you to our guests for sharing their story, and thank you for listening today. Keep in mind that every small business is unique and there is no such thing as one-size-fits-all advice, so only take what you find helpful. We look forward to next time.